UNHCR is funded by the United Nations, but only gets a small part of its, I should say, from the United Nations. It gets the tremendous, like it's something in the neighborhood of only $20 million from the United Nations. The rest is all from donors, and we have a budget of about $6 billion, and of which we've received about 3.6, 3.5. I'm not sure where we are right now, but it's all from donations of states. So we're very beholden to donors to make this, to do our work. That being said, activities like resettlement, for example, are usually paid for by the receiving country. Whether it's Canada, the United States, Australia, they actually are responsible for the logistics and the integration of those refugees, as you can imagine. Because there's two streams. First, there's the government-assisted refugee stream, which is the national program, which effectively is, funded by you and me as taxpayers. That is part of Canada's response to refugees. In addition to the aid it receives as part of its immigration program a select number of refugees for the government-assisted, or we call the GAR program. And then there's also a civil society-based private sponsorship of refugees program, where you have faith communities or organizations like World University Services Canada or other ethnocultural groups who try to sponsor refugees. And these are in addition to the government-assisted program. When refugees come through the National Government-Assisted Refugee Program, they only receive basically social assistance rate assistance. So if you're looking at a family of four, I'm not sure I'm up on this, but usually they tell private sponsors to plan, if you're thinking about like a family of four, and depending on the community you are in, etc., somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000+ for a year of assistance. But these individuals come as permanent residents to Canada. They also have to repay their transportation loan that they received from the government, as well as the cost of their medicals. And they're eligible to find employment. And so as soon as they become independent, or if they become independent before that first year is over in terms of assistance, then that assistance ends. So it could be less than that amount. Resettled refugees, because they have no other solution, in fact, they have one of the highest uptakes of citizenship, because they come as permanent residents, and Canada's integration programs effectively direct people to integration, direct them to become permanent residents, want them to establish roots, want them to obtain Canadian values and participate in society. And this is, I think, personally, what has been part of the Canadian success in terms of its reception model, its integration model. So I think they have, among all the immigrant groups that come to Canada, whether it's economic, family class, entrepreneur, and then refugees have the highest uptake of citizenship, because for them, they have no other country to go to. And the challenge for refugees in recent years has been that there's been, they're becoming what we refer to as protracted refugee situations. Most refugees, many of the refugee situations in the world are just hanging on longer and longer and longer. So there is no peace to return to. There is no possibility of return. So it's really important for them to be able to obtain citizenship in Canada. The definition of a refugee is set out in the Refugee Convention, and that's, basically deals with a person who has a well-founded fear of persecution, is outside of their country of origin, and is linked with 5 different grounds. As I said, was set out in January 1951, which relate to their fearing persecution because of their political opinion, their membership of a particular social group, their race, their religion, or their nationality. But among those refugees, we try to identify who has no other alternative durable solution. And I've already referred to the 3 durable solutions. The challenge we have is that there are so many refugees right now in protracted refugee situations who have no potential solution. And resettlement is basically, we do an exercise every year where we try to identify how many refugees among the world's refugees will be in need of resettlement. And then we have the reality of resettlement is a voluntary activity of states, so we only have a select number of spaces given to us. I would say normally I'd say about 80 to 90,000 spaces globally are made available to us, even though last year when we were doing our projection for 2016 in terms of who needs resettlement, we estimated there were over 1 million refugees who had no other alternative solution and needed resettlement. So we have this challenge between, we have this, the reality that less than 1% of the world's refugees are resettled every year, and even among the people we identify in need of resettlement, less than 10% of those find a solution. So what we will do is to try to identify those we describe in general terms as most vulnerable. And when we're thinking vulnerable, we're looking at effectively 2 different areas. Refugees who are vulnerable in terms of their protection, because there may be a risk of what we call refoulement, forcibly being returned to the country of origin where they fear persecution, which no refugee should be returned to the country they fear persecution, or they may be, detained, for example, because refugees shouldn't be detained simply because they're refugees, or they might be in some sort of physical danger, and that could even be they're a minority in a refugee camp, and so there's a tension between two different refugee groups. So there's vulnerability in terms of protection, and we're talking about, again, in the country of asylum. It's already established that they can't go home, that they fear persecution in their country of origin, but now in the country of asylum, they're again in danger effectively. But so there's what we refer to as legal physical protection needs, but there are also other categories, such as survivors of violence and torture, where because they've experienced torture or because they've been exposed to horrific violence and such, the services needed for them and the impact on their mental health can't be addressed. And so in the country of asylum. So we're looking for a third country they can go to where those needs can be addressed. There's also refugee women at risk, refugees, what we refer to as medical cases, so they're a very small number for whom we can find a solution. Sometimes vulnerable separated children, and those refugees who have no alternative durable solution, which the challenge with that is that it just applies to so many, of course. There are over 4 million, estimate over 4 million refugees, and as I've referred to before, we only have about 80 to 90,000 resettlement spots available to us globally, and there are other refugee populations, of course. Now, that number has gone up somewhat as many countries in the international community have effectively observed the Syrian crisis and have wanted to do more. Examples in Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and in the United States, as well as Canada, which are greatly appreciated because it's certainly needed. But among the refugee population, those 4 million, we have a registration database, and we would have, even when we do an initial registration, we're not talking about resettlement. We've received a family who's just crossed the border, or when they've crossed the border, we've established who's their family membership, and we identify what we refer to as vulnerabilities. And there are a variety of categories that we go through. It could be someone's got a disability, it could be a medical problem, it could be, they've experienced torture, it could be a variety of factors. And so even when we look right throughout that database, we have 400,000 plus individuals who've already been identified as vulnerable among the Syrian population. So this is likely, when we're looking for resettlement referrals, this is likely where we start, where we would go through the database and say, okay, among that database, who makes the most sense? We would look for things, for example, connection to particular countries. It doesn't make, if we have information that, a person has a family member in Finland, it wouldn't make sense to refer that case to Canada. But we're fortunate to have about an acceptance rate of about 90% of the cases that we refer to Canada. Um, but what happens is once we've prepared that case, we submit it to a Canadian embassy. Then you have a Canadian Foreign Service officer who conducts their own interview. And that person has to deem the person's eligible and admissible. To be eligible for resettlement, the refugee must be found to be by the visa officer, not just by UNHCR as a refugee, but the Foreign Service officer also finds that person to be a refugee. They also have to have no other alternative durable solution, meaning, the visa officers determined that they can't go back to their country of origin, that that they can't locally integrate, and they have to be referred by us, and also show an ability to integrate it to Canada over time. So that's just the eligibility, but there's also admissibility portion, which Canada has for any person coming to Canada as a permanent resident, and that deals with basically security concerns, criminal inadmissibility questions, and medical restrictions.